In this video, we'll be examining 3 different case studies to learn more about government debt and budget deficits. For years, the U.S. was thought to have the safest bonds around, and buyers were very confident that the bond would be paid in full when the bond fully matured. But in 2011, Standard & Poor, which is a major private agency that evaluates the safety of bonds, downgraded the U.S. credit rating from a AAA rating, which is the best that you can have, to a AA rating. Why did this happen? Well, it was partly due to huge budget deficits from 2009 to 2011, but it was mostly because of the long-term outlook that economists had for the USA. Demographic changes were a big reason why the U.S. credit rating was downgraded. Medical advances have increased life expectancy, and improvements in birth control have decreased the number of children that people have. In other words, the elderly are becoming a larger share of the population. 1/3 of the government budget goes towards the elderly and is set aside for pensions and Social Security. When you combine that with the rising healthcare costs that the U.S. has, economists are not confident about the next several decades for the U.S. because of such deficits.
In part 2 of this video on government debt and budget deficits, we will look at the case study number 2 of George Bush's withholding experiment. In early 1992, President George Bush pursued a policy to deal with the lingering effects of recession in the U.S. By executive order, he lowered the amount of income taxes that were being withheld from workers' paychecks. This policy did not reduce the amount of taxes that workers owed, but merely delayed the payment. The goal of this policy from Bush's perspective was to get consumers to spend this extra income on things like clothing, college, or a new car, in order to stimulate aggregate demand. This is in direct conflict with the Ricardian equivalence theory, which says consumers in this situation would save the extra income because their overall lifetime resources would be unchanged. Although the results of this policy were difficult to track, a survey in the end conducted by 2 economists determined that 57% of consumers said that they would save the additional income as a result of this policy, while 43% said they would spend. So in the end, Bush's policy might have been somewhat effective and absolutely been able to at least stimulate a little bit of aggregate demand in order to combat recession. But the overwhelming results say that people would still be aware that they had to eventually pay the taxes back, and instead they would save their additional income.
In part 3 of this video on government debt and budget deficits, we will look at the case study called The Benefits of Indexed Bonds. To begin, we will look at the history of indexed bonds. In 1997, the U.S. Treasury Department started to issue bonds that pay a return based on the Consumer Price Index. These bonds typically pay a low interest rate of about 2%, but that interest payment grows with the overall price level as measured by the Consumer Price Index. Professors of macroeconomics no longer need to define the real interest rate as an abstract concept. Of course, it's easier to teach but that was not the reason the Treasury chose to index some of the government debt. Its goal was to introduce a new type of government bond that would benefit bondholder and taxpayer alike. These bonds are a win-win proposition because they insulate both sides of the transaction from inflation risk. In part 2, we are going to look at the 3 benefits that indexed bonds have. First, the bonds may encourage the private sector to begin issuing its own indexed securities. Financial innovation is, to some extent, a public good. The Treasury indexed bonds can be viewed as a remedy for that market future. Second, the bonds reduce the government's incentive to produce surprise inflation. The greater the government's nominal debt, the more incentive the government has to inflate away its debt. The Treasury switch toward indexed debt reduces this potentially problematic incentive. And third, the bonds provide data that might be useful for monetary policy. Many macroeconomic theories point to expected inflation as a key variable to explain the relationship between inflation and unemployment. One way to measure it is to survey private forecasters. Another way is to look at the difference between the yield on nominal bonds and the yield on real bonds of the same maturity. To summarize, the Treasury indexes bonds therefore produce many benefits. First, less inflation risk, more financial innovation, better government incentives, more informed Treasury policy, and easier lives for students and teachers of macroeconomics.